Hey guys, and welcome to an updated material workflow lesson that I felt was essential to get out before lesson 5 because as I finished the scene files, I realized that things were quite unoptimized, and going through and getting you to repeat that wasn't going to be doing anyone any favors. So it's, call it trying to be a perfectionist, but I just really felt like I needed something new and up to date that was a lot more automated than the type of materials you're going to see in lesson 5. I'm always about trying to make things as easy as possible, and unfortunately the assets in lesson 5 didn't really go down that route, and I spent a lot of time making custom shaders for them. Now I will break down how I did that within lesson 5, but for a more general and broad workflow, this is what I'd suggest using from this point forward. As I finished the lesson 5 scene files, I realized that I'd learned enough and there was enough new features released within V-Ray to warrant going in and creating an update on material creation within V-Ray. I've always said that V-Ray has the most powerful material creation, and hopefully I can show you why that's the case in this lesson. But before I jump into showing you some of the new artistic features, I want to break down the new workflow that I'm using and why I'm using it. So in this scene, you'll see that there's two separate materials. On the left, I've got a material labeled complex, and this is created the way that I used to and that you'll be familiar with in Mastering V-Ray Lesson 4, or the free lesson. That's where every single material that's kind of built up within the entire shader is placed on its own layer within the V-Ray blend material. And then those individual shaders are masked off in the blend maps. Now, from a practical point of view, this workflow is really efficient and it makes it easier to figure out where things are in the scene. I've spoken to the guys at Cream and asked them what their opinion on this is, and they prefer to use this method where each layer has its own material and they've got easy control over it. The problem with that is that I severely underestimated how much slower using this method is than trying to do it all within the one V-Ray material. So from a technical point of view, disregarding the reflection BRDFs because they can't be replicated, you should be able to go in and create all of the same features in a single one-layered V-Ray material that you can with the V-Ray blend material. Now, like I said, short of going in and adding a second reflection coat and changing those properties, everything can look identical. And that's why I've set this scene up. So what I've got on the left here is a history of the two renders done with both of these materials. I've got a render done with the complex material and the simple material. Now the render time was over 1:20 shorter for this single layered V-Ray material. Now that was pretty damning for me. I was thinking maybe there was going to be like a 20 or 30, maybe max 20% slowdown, but it's nearly double. It's 40% slower this way, and the result, as you can see here, is pixel for pixel pretty much identical apart from the random noise between each render. Now every time I do testing in V-Ray, I do my best to speak to the developers and ask their opinion on some of the results I'm getting. Now I haven't spoken to Vlado yet, but apparently this speed difference here isn't meant to be so extreme. Now, I don't know if that's a bug or if it's just the way V-Ray is working and the developer's information was a little bit off, but the fact is, for now, until something is done about that, we've kind of got no choice but to use this new method. So before I just jump straight into working with it, I'll just give you a very basic rundown of how it works now. So basically, rather than controlling individual V-Ray materials and the maps within those, what we're going to be doing from now on is going in and keeping it simple by having one V-Ray material, and we're going to be controlling the diffuse and the reflection and the bump maps with composite maps, and we're going to be layering the detail within those maps. So what I can do here is, you'll see the difference. I've got the gray, the red, and the green material all being layered, and that's affecting everything else in these shaders apart from the diffuse is identical. So the only thing that's being blended separately here is the diffuse color. So there's no reason I can't go in and make a single V-Ray material and influence the diffuse color with a composite map. So now, instead of having the blend maps in the coat materials, I've stolen those and I've used those exact same green and red blend amounts inside the composite map here. So these Burcon maps that you're seeing control things are literally identical, and it means you end up with a pixel for pixel identical result, except the way I assume V-Ray is working is when you work with a V-Ray blend material, it's calculating that layer and then blending it together in post. Whereas V-Ray, what it's doing with this method is calculating it all as one single material, and that's where you get the render speed up. It might turn out that I'm wrong in that sense, but the render times have basically alluded to that. So I'm going to open up a scene now, and we're going to work with some metal shaders, and I'm going to show you some of the new features that I've been using in order to get the best results out of V-Ray. So as you guys know, whenever I'm creating materials, I've always said that the realism is completely dependent on the amount of effort you put into adding layered detail. So there's two ways you can go about adding detail on a shader. You can do it manually in Photoshop to an unwrapped object, or you can do it procedurally, which is more the format you're used to me working with, trying to not rely on UV maps. So I'm happy to say that within this lesson, all of these shaders are completely procedural and rely heavily on the V-Ray Triplanar texture map. Now, I've explained the importance of this map before in the sampling update lesson, but because I haven't gone in and created a material update lesson, you haven't really seen how I'm using it or the tricks I use to gain further control over the maps directly inside of 3ds Max, which leads me to another point. I've stopped relying on Photoshop to go in and adjust my textures. So 6 months ago, and I just load up this V-Ray Light material with a triplanar texture loaded, you'll notice that I shot and released for free for you guys a whole range of smudge and dust textures. Now I shot these for a very specific purpose, and that was using them directly inside the triplanar texture. Now what my goal was to no longer rely on Burcon textures, because hand shooting photos produces so much more subtle variation and realism. Now the good news is these are working extremely well. The only problem is that I could probably have a little bit more variation within the textures I've supplied for you. So I'm going to work on trying to build that library, because every single material you create should technically be making use of these, even if it's just in a very subtle manner. You'll see, let me just load these up one more time for you. Not all of them are extremely obvious. You can see some just have very subtle swash marks, and it's that type of detail that most people don't notice, but if it's not there, you definitely do notice that something's missing. Now, like I said, one thing I'm doing lately is not adjusting textures inside of Photoshop. The reason for that is because every time I was making a new version or adjustment, it was becoming more and more complex to manage my library of textures, and I just thought, screw it, just adjust them all in 3ds Max from this point forward. So you'll see in this lesson I make heavy use of the output map to gain further control over these textures. Now, if the map is too blown out or too contrasty, you can adjust that inside of here, and by decontrasting the map, you can drag down the right point and raise the left point, and we've just got control over that. What you'll notice in the past that I might have done is I could have gone in and added a color correction map and then kept it as a base and then gone in and adjusted that here. However, I'm not 100% certain that the color correction map isn't slowing things down or adding another level of calculation required at render time. And it's just simply easier to adjust that stuff directly inside of the curves. So you'll notice throughout the lesson that I might be going in and adding points to these maps to gain further control over different areas. And basically the way these curves work is the exact same as Photoshop. More to the left side, you're adjusting the darker areas of the map, and more to the right and upper end of these curves, you're adjusting the bright areas. So you can see I've added a point here, and that's only affecting the dark areas. So it's important to make note of that if you ever want to gain finer control, say over a smudge map, and the thumbprints are a little bit too glossy, you can go in, find the area where that's being affected on the map, and simply raise or lower it. So the first material I'm going to create is going to be loosely based on the two silver materials you're seeing here on the right. They're very old and worn out, but there's still a shine to them, and you can still see that they're very metallic. In order to do that, Of course, the first thing you're always going to do is look for reference. So I've got up every single time I start a new project, I'll go to Google and I'll just set up a whole row of tabs. You can do this however you want, load the images into Photoshop. It doesn't really matter. I'm a pretty unorganized artist and I just like having something here on the two screens left and right to look at. Of course, at this stage, you're trying to figure out the type of features you want in the shader and how the material that you're referencing works. So the very first thing I'll do here is try and find a material that's similar to what I want to create and then look at the features that make it up. So the highest resolution image I've got in the row of reference here, and it won't be what I base this on 100%, but it's high res enough where I can go in and see that there's a lot of nice detail to bring out in this shader. Okay, I'm assuming you've got your high res reference on the right or left so you can constantly monitor how the material's looking. But to get started with silvers or any metals, the first thing you want to do is remove the diffuse value. The reason you're doing that is because from a scientific point of view, technically metals don't have a diffuse value, and it's easier to start with none and figure out how the reflections are working than to maybe introduce too much color and get those values wrong. So I'm going to raise the reflection value up to 1, and then I'm going to unlock the Fresnel IOR value. Now for silver, the value is 0.18. If you were working with a different material like gold or bronze, just search for those values online and plug them in here. Now I will say later on, this might get a little bit more complicated when we try and figure out how multiple materials are going to be sitting in the scene, but for now I can just stick with this value and get on to working out how the reflection glossiness is going to be working. Now thankfully, in my reference image, the HDR is kind of comically similar. Let me just bring this up for you here. I haven't planned for this, but sometimes you get lucky, you know what I mean? You can see that in the reference, we've got two hotspots here, and it's kind of like an inside room, and it's kind of midday. Now, if we go to my HDR, I've got lined up here, we've got an inside room with two lights with a very similar set of colors. So I'm fairly confident that I can get this material matched really closely. The next thing I'm going to do is go and set the BRDF to GGX as usual. Now I could start adjusting the tail fall off, but it won't have any effect until you lower the reflection glossiness value below 1. Now it's also important to realize that there are a couple of tricks with the GGX tail fall off feature that V-Ray has, and I'm pretty sure no other render engine has at the moment. For me, it's extremely useful in simulating those really shiny chrome surfaces that still have that long specular tail. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to drop the reflection glossiness down to 0.99, and that's all you need to do to really start playing with this value and seeing how it affects the material. If I drop it down to 1.5, you can see there's not really much effect here. So I'll go a little bit lower. Now as I go to 1.1, we start getting that really nice chrome reflection tail fall off. So moving forward, it's important to realize that the reflection glossiness and the GTR tail fall off values are semi-linked. The lower you go on the reflection glossiness, the higher I tend to go on the GTR tail fall off. And that's because with low tail fall off values, if you go lower on the reflection glossiness as well, and I'll input 0.9 here as an example, you see the effect that happens. We end up with a really blurred surface. Now in the reference, we've got more of a chrome-like appearance, so to counteract that, I have to go up on the GTR tail fall off value. The higher I go on that value, the more compressed the specular highlight's going to become, and the less the reflection blurriness will change based on the angle. But of course now, with these values, we're a little bit off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to 1.3, a little bit higher than we were at, and I'm going to raise the reflection glossiness to 0.95. Now we've changed the values, but we've got a similar tail fall off to what we were getting before with 0.99 and 1.1. At the moment, I'm only using a simple sphere as the shader ball because I just want to clearly see how that tail fall off value is being affected. This is one of the most important and basic features in the shader, so rather than using a really complicated water jug model that I had up earlier, I decided to start as simple as possible. But now that we've got to a point where we need to start going in and adding some of the detail in the shader, I'm going to hide this, or just delete it, whatever you really want, and then unhide the jug. Now I'm going to see how the jug is looking with this shader on, and I'll see if I need to go in and adjust the reflection glossiness or the tail fall off. Now I don't need to see every part of this object to get a feel for how the shader is working, so I'm just going to enable region rendering and just zoom up at the top here. Before moving on, I'm just going to have a quick play with the tail fall off and the reflection glossiness one last time to try and determine if I made any mistakes on that simple sphere. And this is the type of stuff that it's difficult to try and include in the lesson because it makes the lessons go longer. But if I don't include it, you might assume that, you know, material creation is a little bit more easy than I let on. So I try and include that small detail so that you can see that at different stages of the material creation process, I'm always testing and playing with numbers to get a better feel for how the material is behaving. I don't just try and put these numbers in from memory. I always do it based on how it's looking in the engine itself at that specific time. So just before moving on, I'm going to have a quick play with the tail fall off value now that I've got a more detailed object in the scene. So by lowering this value, I'm able to produce a result that looks more like a pearly chrome or something you'd see on a metallic car paint. So if you're trying to create those materials, just remember that you can create a really nice white chrome by having a high glossiness value with a very low tail fall off value. I found it produces really realistic results, and it's something specific to V-Ray because no other engine has this fall off value. Now we've got a very basic silver shader here, and I know it took a little while to get to this point, but in a real-time situation where I'm not trying to explain anything, this process should only take a couple of minutes tops. You don't want to go in and make maps too early. You just want to get the very basic core structure of the material set up correctly, so when you go in and add the layers over the top of this, it's physically correct and looks like the reference. So I'm back inside of Photoshop here, and I'm trying to analyze where my next move is going to be on the shader. If I look closely, I can notice a couple of main features that I need to implement, and they're probably equally important. So it doesn't really matter which one I tackle first, but just as long as I know how they're kind of behaving. So what I can see here is in the crevices, we've got a kind of oxide-y type metal that's got a brown reflection and a brown diffuse color, and it kind of blends between a dark brown. We've got little elements of blue in here, and there's also a bit of red. So it's not a very simple setup, and there's quite a bit of detail there to capture in the shader. On top of that, we've also got the reflection color being tinted where grime is built up. So you can see in the crevices and in the, the worn away areas, we've got a little bit more brightness and silvery appearance, and in these darker, cavity areas, we've got a more gold-like appearance. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is work on the reflection color and try and get this gold appearance settled in. When you get to the point where you're going in and adding maps and textures to your shader, I'd strongly suggest going into the production render mode by swapping down the bottom here and adding the V-Ray denoiser element. Now I've already explained what this is doing inside of the sampling lesson, but on top of that, it also gives us a whole bunch of render elements that are useful in determining how different parts of the shader are reacting. So inside the reflection filter, for example, we can see the raw color that V-Ray is using to determine how reflective the object is. The slight variations you're seeing here are a result of the Fresnel equation coming into place. But on top of this, it also lets us know the raw color for the reflection. So we've got a couple of different options in getting that gold effect working quite well in the scene here. There's the simple way, and then there's the hard way. So I'm going to start with the simple way first. We can go in and add a simple V-Ray dirt material, and you'll see that this affects the reflection filter instantly, because in the occluded areas now we're introducing that black color as the reflection. Now I'm not trying to darken off the reflection here, I'm just trying to tint it. So if we go back into the reference, you'll notice that there's not a sudden darkening in those areas, it's just adding a little bit more gold color. So in the occluded areas, I can go in, and you notice on the value area here, I don't want to go too dark. This value has to be quite light. I'm going to back off on the saturation, And I'm going to go back into the beauty just to see how this is affecting things. Now I can go lower on the radius, and that's going to control how spread those samples are. So if we go back to the reflection filter, you see in areas like this where the handle's being occluded, that's not exactly the effect we want. So I can drop that further, and now you see that it doesn't really come into play there. But because we've dropped the radius so low, we're losing the effect of the shader. This is where we can drop the distribution value, and that's going to pull the occluded areas closer to the edges in the scene. You'll see the effect. If I go to 0.5, it's very subtle. If I go to 0.1, still hard to see. Now I can go into the negative here, and that's when it really starts to become apparent and we start getting the effect we desire. So now I've lowered the radius, so we're not getting occlusion from the object itself, but we are getting that nice spread reflection color. Now I'm going to go back to the reference and just see how far this is spreading. And if you look closely, you can see that, in some areas it's quite large and the radius is fairly big, and in other areas it's barely visible at all, and it's mostly just that solid silver color. But the yellow material is kind of visible everywhere in the scene. Now this is the simple way of doing it. If you want finer control over the reflection color, you're going to have to go in and make a gradient ramp and map an occlusion map to that. It's kind of hard to explain, so I'm just going to do it and show you as the effect is coming into place. So inside the reflection slot, I'm going to hit the V-Ray Dirt button and replace it with a gradient ramp. You can discard the old map. Now the first thing you'll notice is that the gradient ramp, when the gradient type is set to linear, is based on the UVs of the object, which isn't what we want. We want to swap things to use a procedural texture, so in order to do that, I'm going to set it to mapped. Now we can control the color inside this gradient with a procedural texture. So I'm going to load the V-Ray Dirt into there. And the first thing I'm going to do is, because I've already set up these settings, is swap it to how we had it in the previous dirt map. Then I'm going to explain to you how this system works. I'm going to drop the distribution back down again so it crunches that value. Okay, so when you map a gradient ramp, basically from dark to white, you can control where the colors are. So in a V-Ray Dirt map, the occluded areas are black, and this is where we've got control here. Obviously in the white areas, we've got the other end of the spectrum of the gradient ramp to control things. So you notice now, if I click on this left-hand button, I can control the color. And I'm going to set it up to be similar to how we had it before. But the best part about this is if I want to create a more gradiated kind of rainbow color or tint, now I've got that option. So I can go in and add a couple more points here and just vary the color up a little bit. I can add a bit more red. I can maybe add a little bit of green. I can add a bit of blue. And then I could go back to maybe a whiter material or like this. Now it's hard to see how that's affecting things, but if I go into the reflection filter, now you can see we've got full control over the entire range of this dirt map. So in these blue areas, I can make those extremely saturated, and you see the effect that has. It's a really nice way of gaining that little bit of extra control over your reflection color, and possibly adding in a little bit more variation. The other benefit of using a gradient ramp like this is we've got a very quick way of distorting this so that we introduce a bit of noise. So in the noise slot here, just drag this value up, and you might want to play with the size. And straight away we can just vary where this is coming into place. Like the reference, it's not the same thickness everywhere. But of course, this is just one way of achieving that result. Another way of doing it is if I disable the noise here, I can go into the V-Ray Dirt map, and instead we can control this with the radius texture. Now just so the effect I'm about to put in is a little bit more obvious, I went in and quickly took out the colors while not recording, just so that it's gone back to a simple black and white map. Now in the source map, in that V-Ray dirt, I can go into the radius and I'm going to apply a V-Ray triplanar texture. Just like every other time I go to load a texture here, I'm going to be relying on that because I don't have UVs on this object set up correctly. Now, before adding a significant new feature to the shader, I'll always spend some time to look more closely at the main reference I have, but I'll also go into Google and search for some additional stuff just to get a better feel for how this effect might come into place. Every time I look for new reference, it's just more solidifying in my head how this feature looks, so hopefully down the road I don't need any reference and I can just do this a little bit more creatively. But this is the type of example I'm trying to achieve, where in the grime areas, there's some areas that are very thin and there are other areas that are very spread and thick. And the type of map you load is going to determine how that effect looks. Now, if I were to load in Max a really high frequency texture, say for example, let me go into the triplanar and show you. If I were to load a texture like this with lots of tiny black areas, we'd be getting lots of tiny pits in the dirt. So in order to get an effect that's a little bit more large, I need to use a map which has large scale detail. So I'm going to load Smudge 006. And straight away we'll see how this is affecting the radius when we go to the reflection filter. But by default, if you remember I said I was going to be adjusting maps now directly in Max, that's because with things like this, the dark areas aren't dark enough and I need to increase the contrast in this map so it goes from perfectly white to perfectly black. That's going to give us much more of an immediate transition from thick to thin areas. The easiest way to do that is to load 2 points inside of the output. You just click on the add point option and add them there. I'm going to drag the left point down and I'm going to drag the right point up. I'm going to set both of these to be Bezier. Now the next step, depending on the map you load, you're going to need to drag this left and right. Now with a map that's a lot darker, you'll need to drag it more left. Now if your starting map is more bright like mine, you'll need to drag it to the right. Now you can see straight away that the variation we're seeing here is a lot more sudden. And the result is that some areas of the dirt are very thick and other areas up here are quite thin. But also it's important to realize the scale of the map is going to determine this as well. So in order to get things a little bit more how I want them, I'm going to go up on the scale inside of the V-Ray triplanar texture map. Now, as I've explained in the sampling lesson, the higher I go on this scale value, the more it's going to tile the map, as you can see here. So I'm just going to adjust this until I'm happy with it, and basically adjusting this is just like adjusting a seed. You know, I'm just going to see how this looks. So when I set things to 0.04, I get a really cool effect. You know, I can even play with half values just to see how this is working. If I don't like how quickly the transition's happening, I can always back off on the contrast by dragging this left point more left, like that. I can stretch out the Bezier handle. And now the transition's a little bit softer. Another thing to note is while you're working with this, you can also adjust the radius. If now all of a sudden the radius is a little bit too obvious and things are a little bit too large, I can drop that even further. Now I can see the effect has been shrunk a bit, but I'm going to stick with 2. I'm going to go back into the map. I'm just going to introduce a little bit more contrast. I'm going to drop the handle value here and pull this over. You can see the effect it has here. This is the beauty of working in RT, and I really wish that GPU was available because it's so much faster, but in the next lesson I'll definitely be working with GPU. Now of course, while I've been adjusting this, you can see the effect really clear, but I did go back and adjust the reflection colors. So I'm going to go now and affect and reintroduce that yellow color. just to better see how this is working, I'll go back into the reflection filter. It's going to get that green color that's slightly, I've always found that whatever variation you add, if it's subtle, adding that one feature with a little bit of variation isn't noticeable, but after you add multiple features, it all comes together and you do notice that the shader is a lot more detailed than you first realized. It's just some subtle stuff here. I can let go of the region rendering just to get a better feel for how it might be affecting other areas of the mesh. And we get a really nice effect. Now those colors are a bit too saturated, I think. Just going to back off on the saturation, make it a little bit more. Now I don't want the reflection to be perfectly white, so I'm going to drop the right hand side of the gradient down a little bit. Now remember, if I drop this down to black, we're going to get no reflection in those areas. So this area of the gradient is controlling the convex areas, or the areas that aren't that aren't being occluded. Let's raise this up to 245. Now I've just let things clear up a little bit more in the render so you can see how this gradient ramp is affecting the reflection color, and I think it looks pretty good. In the pitted areas we are getting a slight variation. I don't think it's too strong, but remember, down the road, if I ever want to go in and adjust that, we've just got very easy control here in the gradient. Now the next thing I want to do is go back into the reference, and now we're going to try and incorporate this effect. So we've gone in and added the gold tint, but now we've got to go in and make this kind of patina bronzy effect. Now the next part is going to be really hard to explain because you guys only see the end result of the lessons, but the process from starting a scene to completing a tutorial can sometimes be all over the place, and this lesson is a perfect example of that, because if you go back to the start of this lesson when I was explaining what I was going to be doing and how I was going to be reproducing a couple of the shaders you see down the bottom here, even these shaders have things wrong with them, and you only really notice some things you're doing wrong as you record. So I always try and include some of those errors in the lessons so you can see that it's not such a straightforward process and you do constantly learn new ways of doing things. So what I discovered is that now that we're creating materials on one layer, we have to go about the way we control the reflections in certain parts. Whereas in the past, say we had a V-Ray blend material with a silver that had a certain Fresnel value and then a pitted top that was being blended in the crevices with a different Fresnel value, I didn't used to simulate that correctly. As you can see in this material down the bottom here, the Fresnel IOR value isn't mapped. The way I've made the pitted areas appear to be less reflective is by simply darkening off that. But that's not physically correct, because when you think about what that material actually is, it's not a metal. So its Fresnel value will be closer to 1.5, more like a plastic. But if you just drop the reflection amount, that plastic area is still going to have a really high Fresnel value of 5. So what I realized I had to do is I have to map the Fresnel value so that I had the same control that I did in the V-Ray blend material in a single V-Ray material. So the issue we have with using this Fresnel IOR value mapped is that if you use a texture, it's going to map the IOR from 0 to 1. Now if we go into this material and map it at 1, you can see there's no reflection at all, and if we map it to 0, it's completely reflective. So mapping a texture by itself doesn't give you a physical result, and it doesn't let you have finer control over the individual Fresnel values in the same way we do at the base here. So the way to gain control over this is to load a composite map. Now inside the color, what we're going to do is we'll go down and load a V-Ray color. I'm going to set the color to white here. Now this single V-Ray color is controlling the Fresnel value. So because I set that to white, you'll remember when we set the Fresnel IOR to white here, V-Ray has 0 reflection. Now if we go to the RGB multiplier, this will be our new Fresnel value. So for this layer, I can set it to 1.5, and now the material will have that much less reflective plastic-like coat. If I set it to 0.18, we get the silver appearance again. So the math is working correctly using this method. Now the way to gain control is to add another layer. Now I can duplicate this over the top. If I set the RGB multiplier to 1.5, now I've got two different layers here in the composite map with different Fresnel values. At the base we have 0.18, which is more like our silver, and on the top we have our 1.6, which is more like plastic. Now what I can do is using a very similar technique to gaining control over the reflection color, I can apply a V-Ray dirt here, and in the crevices I'm going to flip the colors, because now I want just in the crevices the Fresnel value that's associated with this layer of 1.6. And as an end result, what you get is in the occluded areas, we have a material with a value of 1.6, and in the unoccluded areas, we have a silver material with an IOR of 0.18. Now, whenever you start using a new feature, try and invest a few minutes into figuring out how exactly it works. See, I wasn't exactly sure what this value was doing when I plugged a specific texture into it. Now what it does is, if you load just a standard bitmap into here with some values being white and some being dark, for example one of my grunge maps, it's going to map those Fresnel values simply from 0 to 1. The issue with that is correct Fresnel values go above 1. For example, if you have a really strong metal, it can have a Fresnel value of 8. Now even if you've got a perfectly white texture, that's still only reading as 1. So I needed a way to around this limitation, and the solution to that was adding a composite map. Now instead of loading a bitmap, what I'm going to do is I'm going to load a V-Ray color. I'm going to make the color pure white, or 1 in RGB terms. Now I've got control over the pure mathematical value with the RGB multiplier. So if I set this to 0.18, I'm going to have the exact same value as I do inside of V-Ray. And I can prove that by going down into the maps option and unticking the unticking the Fresnel IOR, and you'll see that it's identical. If I set it to 1.6, which is more like plastic, you'll see that the material becomes a lot darker because now it's way less reflective. So knowing that I've got full control over those values, now I can add layers, and in the crevices where I've got that patina effect happening, I've got very specific control over the exact Fresnel value I want. So I'm going to drag that base layer up into the top here, and I'm going to set that RGB multiplier to 1.6 like plastic. And now in a very similar way in which we were controlling the reflection color, in the opacity slot, I can load a V-Ray dirt map. Now remember, this is masking where that Fresnel value of 1.6 is being applied, and we only want it to go into the occluded areas. By default, the V-Ray dirt map is setting the occluded areas to black. Because it's an opacity map, white areas are controlling where that effect is taking place. So I'm going to invert the colors. And now I can start controlling where I want that pitted IOR value to go. Now, depending on the type of material you're working with, you might decide at this point to also start working on the diffuse value, because usually when you get these pitted areas, the diffuse color changes quite drastically. But thankfully, because we're working with a metal that doesn't have any diffuse, I don't need to worry about that yet. Now, when we're controlling where that pitted material is going to be, we can use very similar settings to how we set up the reflection. So I'm just going to go back and remind you kind of what we worked with there inside of the dirt map. We had a V-Ray triplanar texture set up as the radius, and we had the distribution set to -1.5. Now, because this pitted material is in like the tighter areas of the mesh, and let me just bring the reference up to show you, you can see in these areas here. Whoops. I'm going to use a smaller radius on this. I'm going to go, and before I change that in the wrong area, I'm going to go into the Fresnel IOR value, and in that mask, I'm going to set it to 1. I'm going to set the distribution to -2. I can go into the reflection filter to see that. Maybe I'll even go lower on the radius. Even lower, because I just want it in the tiny cracks. Just letting it render just to see how it's looking. And I think it's pretty good. I might need to go in and change the actual IOR value for this, or at least change the reflection glossiness in these areas. But for now, I want to go in and add a triplanar texture once again to the radius. Now I've already shown you how I set up that last one. So I'm just going to load the bitmap. And if you remember, the larger the detail in the texture you choose, the larger the variation is going to be. So this time, I want to choose something which has a little bit more small scale detail. Because if we go back to the reference again, you can see the pitted areas don't have that large kind of washy shape. You know, it's much smaller, and it's much harder to see that undulating effect. If I zoom in here, you know, this is the type of detail I'm looking at. How it wobbles in the surface. Just go to the reflection filter. And now I'm going to adjust the map once again, increase that contrast, add the 2 points. You can see as I drop that value in these black areas, it's just not spreading very far. If I pull this over further right, you'll see that the map gets even smaller, and it's only going to be adding in those small areas of the map that are white. I can set both of these to Bezier at the same time, just to give it a bit of a soft fall off on the edge. Now what I'm trying to do here is I don't want so much contrast where I can see that obvious transition. I just want some subtle variation. Now because I also think the scale's wrong, I'm going to increase that and just see the effect this is having. Now I'm going to zoom out and once again drop the radius and play with that effect. I think it was looking a little bit better at 0.2. I'm going to go in and change the Fresnel value for that layer to 1.8, just so it's a little bit more reflective. And I think the next thing to implement at this point, because those pitted areas aren't looking correct, is to change up the glossiness in those areas. And thankfully, because we've already set up the mask for that, it's very easy to go in and do the same in the reflection glossiness slot. So with this dirt map, I'm going to zoom out and copy this. And in the reflection glossiness slot, I'm going to set it as a composite. Now once again, I can set this to be a V-Ray color. I can set the value to 255, and if I set the multiplier to 0.95, I've replicated that value in here of 0.95. So it's the exact same. I'll just disable that so you can see. Zoom in on a small area. Might be a little bit easier. So if I keep things simple, I can add a new layer to this. I can duplicate up that simple V-Ray color. If I, for example, change the RGB multiplier to 0.5, now I'm setting the glossiness to 0.5, as you can see here. Gives the material a completely different look. But of course, I only need this in the pitted areas. So that's why I'm going to paste the the dirt. So that's why I'm going to paste the V-Ray dirt map from the Fresnel IOR slot. And now that's masking where those pitted areas go. In the occluded it's white, and in the unoccluded it's black. So what we're doing now is, by adding in that reflection glossiness map in the composite, is we're saying in the pitted areas have a glossiness value of 0.5. But of course, I don't usually work with very simple kind of values like this. I always do like to map the reflection glossiness in a triplanar texture also. So at the moment, the glossiness of this material is the same everywhere. So to gain control over that, rather than having a V-Ray color, I'm going to swap this to be a V-Ray triplanar texture. I'm going to discard the old map. Now I'm going to load in another one of my smudge maps. I'm going to use something like this. Now in the output, from 0 to 1 here, this is controlling how glossy the material is. So what I'm going to do to demonstrate that is I'm going to hide the top layer here. Now the only thing controlling glossiness on this material is this base triplanar texture. So if I go into that, if I drag and copy this top point and set it to 0, I'll have a value of 0 in the glossiness. If I drag both of these points and set the map to be pure white, we have a perfect mirror-like surface. So I'm going to drop this down to 0. Now you can see it's way too blurry in these dark areas. That's why I need to adjust the map and increase this value. Now we had the value set to 0.95. So I'm going to add a separate point in the center here. And in the dark spots, I just want it to go a little bit dark. I don't want it to be perfectly white. So it's just very subtle here. I don't know if you can see this in the recording, if the quality is lost a little bit, but hopefully you can see in these areas I've just added a tiny bit of variation. I'm going to change the scale of that map. Now the reflection glossiness on the silver is varying, and it's very subtle, and the reason it's noticeable even though those values are subtle is because we've got a very low GTR tail fall off. And like I was saying, when you have a low tail fall off value, and a low reflection glossiness, you get a very spread reflection. And now that I'm seeing this clear up a little bit more, I could probably go into the reflection glossiness